Every valuable thing spends part of its life looking worthless. Every production day at exactly 7:15 in the morning, a yellow forklift backed toward the far edge of the loading yard at Lone Star Wire Products outside Tyler, Texas. This was not an unusual sight. It was routine. The factory produced thousands of feet of galvanized agricultural wire every shift, and every shift ended the same way. Short lengths that could not be wound into standard commercial rolls were removed from the line, loaded into steel bins, and carried to the property boundary. Nobody argued with the process because nobody had designed the process to preserve value. It had been designed to preserve efficiency. The operator tilted the forks, several hundred pounds of leftover wire and battered wooden spool, and slid onto an ever-growing pile. And within seconds he was driving back toward the production floor to repeat the cycle. By the next morning another load would arrive. By the following week the pile would be larger. By the following year nobody could remember where it had started. Drivers hauling cattle trailers, hay wagons, and produce trucks passed it without slowing down. Scrap dealers occasionally estimated its weight. Accountants recorded it as disposal. Plant supervisors referred to it as unavoidable loss. Nobody looked twice because everybody believed they already knew what they were seeing. On the opposite side of the fence, however, one person kept returning before sunrise. Her name was Evelyn Mercer. She never interrupted the workers. She never negotiated prices. She simply waited until the supervisor gave a familiar nod, climbed onto an aging flatbed trailer, carefully selected only certain spool ends, secured each load with weathered ratchet straps, and disappeared down a quiet county road. The same routine continued through spring storms, relentless Texas summers, autumn harvests, and winters so mild the grass beneath the growing piles rarely stopped turning green. After a few years, the employees stopped asking questions. They assumed she was collecting inexpensive material for odd repairs around her farm. Some laughed and called it an unusual habit. Others believed she simply disliked wasting anything. Evelyn never offered an explanation because explanations invite arguments, and arguments reveal intentions. She understood something that almost everyone around her had overlooked. The easiest place to hide an extraordinary idea was inside an ordinary routine. And for 16 years, while an entire industry measured those discarded spool ends by the pound, Evelyn Mercer quietly measured them by a future that nobody else had yet imagined. In eastern Texas, agricultural wire was never considered a finished product. It was part of a much larger system that most people never stopped to think about because the system simply worked. Vineyards depended on it to support acres of muscadine grapes. Cattle ranches stretched it across rolling pasture to guide livestock without wasting timber. Vegetable growers relied on carefully spaced support structures to keep tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and beans growing upward instead of spreading across damp soil where disease moved quickly after summer rain. Every acre that depended on climbing plants depended first on steel, and every foot of steel depended on factories that transformed massive coils of raw rod into precisely engineered strands designed to withstand years of weather, tension, and changing temperatures. Let me tell you about that process because understanding it explains why so much material quietly disappeared before it ever reached a customer. Large coils weighing several thousand pounds entered one end of the production line, where the wire passed through cleaning baths, protective galvanizing, straightening rollers, precision tension controls, and automated winding equipment calibrated to exact commercial lengths. Retail customers expected uniform rolls with consistent diameter, weight, and tensile strength. Distribution warehouses expected identical packaging that could be stacked, inventoried, and shipped across the country without interruption. The manufacturing line was designed for efficiency, not flexibility. Whenever the equipment changed specifications between production runs, or whenever the remaining length on a winding cycle fell short of commercial standards, the machine stopped. Operators removed the remaining material, and the process started again with fresh stock. Nothing about that leftover steel suggested failure. Its zinc coating remained intact. Its structural strength remained virtually unchanged. Its resistance to corrosion still matched the specifications required for outdoor agricultural use. The only problem was economic. It no longer fit the standardized dimensions required by catalogs, wholesalers, or freight schedules. A product that no longer matched the system immediately became a cost instead of an asset. That way of thinking extended far beyond one factory. Across Texas, businesses measured value through uniformity because uniform products simplified transportation, pricing, insurance, inventory management, and customer expectations. Materials that could not fit those categories rarely earned a second evaluation. They simply entered another accounting column and quietly disappeared from attention. Yet nature never cared about standardized lengths. A grapevine climbing toward sunlight did not measure support posts with a tape measure. A blackberry cane twisting around a trellis did not ask whether every horizontal span matched a catalog specification. Plants responded only to strength, durability, spacing, and time. Somewhere between industrial precision and the quiet logic of a growing field existed a difference almost nobody noticed. It was a difference hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone willing to understand materials according to what they could still do instead of what they could no longer become. Let me tell you about Evelyn Mercer because you need to understand the woman before you can understand the decision that quietly shaped the next 16 years of her life. Evelyn was 52 years old in the spring of 2006, and she lived on a modest 28-acre property outside Tyler, where rolling pasture blended into patches of hardwood timber and long rows of muscadine vines stretched toward the morning sun. Her grandfather, Walter Mercer, had settled there after returning from military service in 1946, buying land that larger operations considered too uneven for efficient row crops. Walter believed the land should never be forced to become something it was not. He planted orchards where the soil held moisture, raised cattle on the higher ground, and built every fence with his own hands because he believed understanding a thing always began with building it yourself. Evelyn's father, Raymond Mercer, inherited that philosophy long before he inherited the property. He rarely purchased new equipment if an older tool could still perform the same job with patience and careful maintenance. Saturday mornings during Evelyn's childhood were spent beside him in a weathered workshop where broken hinges became gate latches, worn pipe became irrigation supports, and cracked hardwood found new life as tool handles. Raymond never described himself as creative. He considered himself observant. He often told his daughter that the world discarded objects much faster than it discarded usefulness. Evelyn carried those words into adulthood without realizing how deeply they had settled into her thinking. She studied horticulture for 2 years at a community college near Dallas before returning home when her mother became ill. She never completed a university degree, but she never stopped learning. Agricultural extension bulletins filled one shelf of her farmhouse. Soil reports, pruning manuals, engineering sketches, and notebooks covered another. She walked her fields every evening before sunset, carrying nothing more than a measuring tape, a pencil, and a small spiral notebook already crowded with dates, weather observations, planting diagrams, and questions she intended to answer herself. Neighbors sometimes mistook those quiet walks for routine inspections. They were something much more deliberate. Evelyn believed every season revealed patterns that only appeared to people willing to watch without interruption. She trusted repeated observation more than quick conclusions, and she measured success less by annual income than by whether each year taught her something the previous year had not. That belief shaped nearly every decision she made, including one habit that many people noticed but almost nobody understood. While others searched for immediate profit, Evelyn invested patiently in possibilities that required years before revealing what they had quietly become. Most people assumed Evelyn had a plan from the beginning. She did not. What she had was a habit of asking questions that rarely crossed anyone else's mind. Every load she brought home was sorted the same evening before darkness settled across the property. Pieces of similar diameter were placed together. Longer sections rested on wooden racks built beside the equipment shed. Shorter lengths went into carefully labeled bins according to gauge, coating condition, and flexibility. Curved sections were separated from straight ones, because she had learned that forcing steel back into shape too quickly introduced weaknesses that were difficult to see but easy to discover years later under constant tension. Let me tell you about those evenings because they explain more about Evelyn than any business record ever could. She worked without hurry. A portable radio quietly played local weather reports and college baseball games while she measured, recorded, and stacked each piece with the patience of someone assembling a library instead of storing industrial leftovers. Every few weeks, she experimented with different support designs in a small test garden behind her barn. Some arrangements carried climbing roses. Others supported blackberries, grapes, or pole beans. She noted how different spacing affected sunlight, airflow, harvest efficiency, and maintenance. Whenever a design failed, she did not consider it wasted effort. She simply wrote another observation in her notebook and started again the following weekend. Visitors occasionally noticed unusual frames scattered across the property and assumed she enjoyed building projects. They never realized each structure answered a specific engineering question. Could a lighter brace withstand repeated wind loading across an entire growing season? Would a different angle reduce stress on corner posts? How much tension could a galvanized strand maintain before seasonal expansion altered row alignment? None of those questions interested people looking for quick results. But they fascinated Evelyn because every answer eliminated another uncertainty. Years passed almost unnoticed. Shelves became full, then expanded into additional storage buildings. Her notebooks multiplied until an entire cabinet held nothing but sketches, measurements, weather records, and handwritten calculations. Friends suggested she sell the material by weight and clear the space. Others recommended taking everything to a recycling yard and using the money for newer supplies. Evelyn thanked them politely and changed nothing. She had discovered that collecting material was only a small part of what she was actually building. Far more valuable was the knowledge growing beside it, piece by piece, season after season. Without announcing it to anyone, she was creating a system refined through observation rather than theory, one careful experiment at a time, while almost everyone around her remained convinced they were watching nothing more than an unusual hobby. Let me tell you about the engineering because this is where Evelyn's quiet observations began to separate practical knowledge from common assumptions. Agricultural support systems appear simple from a distance. A row of posts, several horizontal spans, and a climbing crop reaching toward sunlight. In reality, every growing season places thousands of small mechanical stresses on that structure. A mature grapevine can add surprising weight after a summer rain. Strong Gulf winds create continuous side loading across long rows. Daily temperature swings cause metal to expand under afternoon heat and contract before sunrise. If the framework cannot absorb those forces without gradually losing tension, the entire row begins to lean, sag, or twist, reducing airflow around the plants and increasing maintenance for years afterward. Commercial manufacturers solve those problems with standardized products built for the widest possible range of conditions, but standardization always carried a cost. Heavy assemblies required more material, larger shipping pallets, higher transportation expenses, and additional labor during installation. Evelyn approached the same challenge from an entirely different direction. She noticed that many of the pieces she had collected had already been manufactured from high-tensile galvanized steel designed to resist stretching under constant agricultural loads. The protective zinc coating formed a barrier that slowed oxidation even through years of exposure to humidity, rainfall, irrigation, and changing temperatures. Although their lengths varied, their structural properties remained remarkably consistent. She began testing different combinations using calibrated spring scales, tension gauges borrowed from a neighboring vineyard, and simple load experiments performed over several growing seasons. She discovered that shorter sections could distribute force more efficiently when arranged in modular patterns rather than continuous, uninterrupted spans. She learned that carefully positioned connection points reduced concentrated stress, allowing lighter assemblies to remain stable without sacrificing durability. Corner braces behaved differently from center supports. Vine spacing influenced cable deflection more than post diameter under moderate crop loads. Even the orientation of fastening hardware affected long-term alignment after repeated seasonal expansion and contraction. None of those conclusions appeared in product catalogs because manufacturers optimized for mass production instead of local adaptation. Evelyn optimized for field performance. Every notebook filled another shelf with measurements, weather records, installation dates, maintenance intervals, and observations collected year after year under actual farming conditions. She was no longer experimenting with leftover material. She was quietly developing an engineering system shaped by thousands of real-world observations instead of theoretical assumptions. Without attracting attention, she had accumulated something far more difficult to replace than steel itself. She had built 16 years of evidence proving exactly how those structures behaved after countless days of Texas sun, heavy rain, persistent wind, and the slow, patient pressure of living plants. By the beginning of 2022, the assumptions that had guided the agricultural supply business for decades began to fail one after another. Freight schedules slipped without warning. Manufacturers shortened production runs. Dealers who had once promised delivery within a week started telling growers they could not guarantee anything at all. At first, nobody believed the disruption would last. It was another temporary delay, another shipment waiting on another truck. That was what everyone kept telling themselves. Then spring planting arrived. Let me tell you about Eastern Texas that season, because this is where the story finally turned. Vineyard owners postponed new rows because support systems had not arrived. Blackberry growers left survey stakes standing in empty fields, waiting for materials that had been ordered months earlier. Contractors spent more time making apology calls than installing equipment. County suppliers answered the same question dozens of times each day, and every answer sounded almost identical. They did not know when the next shipment would come. They did not know how many units would arrive. They did not know what the new price would be. The shortage spread quietly at first, then all at once. One grower mentioned that a neighbor had delayed planting nearly 12 acres because he could not finish his support system. Another heard that an orchard outside Jacksonville had workers standing idle while unfinished rows stretched across the property. Feed stores, county extension meetings, and coffee counters filled with the same conversations. Everyone needed the same materials, yet nobody seemed able to find them. Then an older vineyard owner remembered something he had almost forgotten. For years he had driven past Evelyn Mercer's farm and noticed trailers carrying unusual loads into her sheds. He had never asked why because, like everyone else, he assumed they were ordinary leftovers waiting to be recycled someday. That assumption suddenly seemed worth questioning. He drove out to her property, expecting little more than a pile of stored material. Instead, Evelyn quietly unlocked the first storage building. Inside, every rack was organized by diameter, strength, application, and length. Detailed engineering drawings covered a large wooden workbench. Shelves held carefully labeled hardware kits prepared years earlier. Installation notes filled cabinets from floor to ceiling. She did not describe it as inventory. She described it as 16 years of preparation. The vineyard owner stood silently for several moments before asking a single question. He did not ask how much she had collected. He asked how soon she could help. Before the end of that week, the story traveled from one farm to another, and the gravel road leading to Evelyn's property carried more unfamiliar pickup trucks than it had seen during the previous 16 years combined. The first customers did not arrive because of advertising. They arrived because another grower quietly told them that someone outside Tyler seemed able to solve a problem no distributor could solve anymore. That was how rural Texas had always shared important information, not through marketing campaigns or polished brochures, but through conversations held beside pickup trucks, at county extension meetings, feed stores, and Saturday morning coffee counters where practical experience carried more weight than promises. Evelyn never expected those conversations to spread beyond neighboring counties. Yet every satisfied customer created another introduction she never had to ask for. Let me tell you about what people discovered when they reached her farm, because it was unlike any purchasing experience they had expected. Instead of opening a catalog and choosing from standardized packages, growers walked through demonstration rows where mature vines climbed structures that had already endured years of changing weather. Evelyn asked questions before discussing materials. She wanted to know the crop variety, row spacing, soil conditions, prevailing wind direction, irrigation layout, expected harvest method, and long-term maintenance goals. She filled several pages with measurements before recommending a single component, because she believed every support system should fit the field instead of forcing the field to fit the product. That approach surprised customers accustomed to buying whatever happened to be sitting in a warehouse. One vineyard owner admitted that no supplier had ever asked about slope orientation before preparing an estimate. Another remarked that he learned more during one afternoon on Evelyn's property than during several equipment demonstrations offered by larger companies. Orders gradually became more complex. Berry farms requested custom corner assemblies. Small orchards wanted adaptable layouts that could expand without replacing existing infrastructure. Market gardeners asked for modular sections they could reconfigure as crop rotations changed from one season to the next. Evelyn rarely answered immediately. She returned to her notebooks, compared years of observations, reviewed previous installations, and often revised a design several times before beginning fabrication. That careful process increased confidence because every recommendation rested on evidence collected over many growing seasons rather than assumptions made inside an office. The people who once believed she had spent years collecting unnecessary material now realized they had misunderstood the most valuable thing she had been accumulating. The organized inventory certainly mattered, but it was only the visible portion of her work. Hidden behind every completed installation stood thousands of handwritten observations, practical experiments, seasonal adjustments, and patient refinements that could not be purchased, copied, or manufactured overnight. What customers trusted was not simply what Evelyn built with her hands. They trusted the years she had invested learning why it worked. The weeks that followed changed more than Evelyn had expected. The first vineyard owner recommended her to another grower before his own installation was even finished. That grower brought a neighbor. The neighbor introduced a family orchard. Soon the telephone on Evelyn's kitchen wall began ringing before breakfast and continued well into the evening. She never hired a salesperson because every new customer arrived carrying the same thing: the recommendation of someone who had already watched her work survive real weather in a real field. Let me tell you what happened next, because this was the moment 16 years of quiet preparation became something larger than one woman's project. Evelyn realized she was no longer building individual support structures. She was building a repeatable approach that farmers trusted. She gave it a simple name that reflected both its origin and its purpose: Mercer Field Trellis. Every design still began the same way. She walked the property with the owner, measured the rows, studied drainage patterns, noted prevailing wind direction, examined soil conditions, and asked how the farm might expand 5 or 10 years into the future. Only after understanding the land did she begin drawing the first layout. No two farms received exactly the same design because she believed every field deserved a solution shaped by its own conditions rather than by a warehouse inventory sheet. That philosophy spread almost as quickly as the installations themselves. County extension agents started mentioning her demonstration plots during educational workshops. Experienced growers brought younger family members to see systems that had already endured years of Texas heat, heavy rain, and seasonal wind without losing alignment. Even equipment dealers who had once dismissed customized construction quietly visited her property to study details they had previously overlooked. Within 18 months, annual sales reached approximately $325,000. But the financial milestone was only part of the story. The greater achievement appeared every harvest season when customers sent photographs showing straight rows, healthier vine canopies, easier maintenance, and productive fields supported by structures designed to last for decades instead of merely surviving another season. Evelyn accepted every photograph with quiet satisfaction because each one confirmed something she had believed since childhood. A well-designed solution should become almost invisible. It should perform its job so consistently that people stop noticing the structure and begin noticing the health of everything it supports. That was never something she could have purchased. It was something she had earned one careful season, one thoughtful observation, and one patient decision at a time. Several years later, visitors driving along the county roads outside Tyler occasionally slowed down as they passed fields supported by clean, carefully engineered frameworks that blended so naturally into the landscape they almost disappeared behind healthy vines and orderly rows. Most of those travelers never knew who had designed them. Evelyn preferred it that way. She had never wanted to become the center of the story because she believed the field itself should always speak first. Let me tell you what changed because it was not only one business or one farm. Younger growers began asking different questions before ordering new infrastructure. Instead of asking what was cheapest, they asked what would still be standing 20 years from now. Instead of copying the largest operation in the county, they studied the specific conditions of their own land. County workshops gradually shifted their discussions from replacing damaged structures to designing systems that prevented unnecessary failures in the first place. Even manufacturers started paying closer attention to modular designs and adaptable layouts as customers demanded solutions built around real farming conditions rather than one universal specification. Evelyn quietly continued filling notebooks long after her business became financially successful. Every completed project added another page of observations. Every unusual weather season added another lesson. Every customer conversation became another opportunity to understand how different soils, crops, and growing methods shape the performance of a well-designed support system. She often smiled when people called her an inventor because she never thought of herself that way. Inventors create something from nothing. She believed she had simply listened longer than most people were willing to listen. One autumn afternoon, a local high school agriculture class visited her property. As the students walked through demonstration rows, one young woman asked what the most valuable thing in the workshop was. She looked across the shelves, the tools, the reference manuals, and the carefully organized materials before pointing instead toward a worn notebook resting on the corner of her workbench. She explained that anyone could buy steel if enough money was available. Anyone could purchase equipment, buildings, and machinery. But no amount of money could instantly purchase 16 years of careful observation, patient testing, honest mistakes, and lessons recorded one season at a time. Knowledge accumulated slowly because nature refused to hurry for anyone. As the students prepared to leave, Evelyn closed the notebook and watched the afternoon sunlight settle across the fields her grandfather had once believed were worth understanding before changing. The land had quietly rewarded that philosophy for 3 generations. In the end, the greatest opportunities are rarely hidden because they are impossible to find. They remain unnoticed because most people stop looking the moment something loses its obvious value, while a patient few continue asking what it might still become.